The League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan political organization, encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. We are totally here today working on all of those points for your benefit. I would like to invite you, if you find this interesting and useful and helpful, to our unit meetings. We meet, and we have unit meetings in every month, except February and during the summer. And they're held at 4 locations. Information about that is on our website, and then there is an interest sheet sign up as you're leaving today if you're interested in that. In September, we're going to talk about voting information. In October, we're going to talk about affordable housing and gentrification. I've lost my other notes here. And then that's our general program. The unit meetings, no, that's it, sorry for the confusion. We also have more general programs coming up, and there is information about that on the website. Detail for all of that is on the sign-up sheet and outside. And if you want, or if you're not a member, you can sign up on the sheet, and then we can gather the contact information and reach out to you and let you know what's going on. Okay? Thank you so much. I really appreciate your being here.
Before we begin our panel discussion, let us remember our home training and make some acknowledgments. First, we want to thank the church for allowing us to use this space for this educational forum. We also want to let you know that we did invite Dr. Michael Hinojosa, Superintendent of the Dallas Independent School District, as well as other members of the Board of Trustees. Unfortunately, their schedules conflicted with ours, so they are not able to attend today. We also want to acknowledge, even though we are not in West Dallas, but we do want you to be aware that we had an individual, Henry Martinez, who translated the flyers into Spanish for that community. And of course, there were community members who distributed the flyers for us, so we're grateful for that. We want you to know that you had a planning committee that worked very hard in order to bring this event about. Things look simple on the surface, but when you start the planning process, it can become quite involved. So, since we're not having them aligned front and center, we will call their names. There's Bill Betson, who's sitting in the back. We have Susan Gosley, who's sitting over here to my right. We have Lynn Davenport, who's sitting up front here. There's Terry Nelson Dumas, who's also a member of that committee. And we are so very grateful for their work. Diane Tassian was also on that planning committee. She and Susie Bell were co-chairs for this event. And of course, we have Reverend Anthony Nolan, who is sitting over here at the end of the table. Raise your hand, Reverend Nolan, so that they can see you. So thank you for your hard work. Our videographer for today is SHTV Productions, and Darren Mason is the individual who is working with us on that process. So thank you very much. We have a timer. who will help us stay on track as we are respectful of your time today. Do you want to give them then some information as to how you will help them use their minutes wisely?
This is to wrap it up. This is just.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Very simple and easy to do. Okay. You have biographical information of our panelists on the back of your program, so at your leisure you can read and be assured that they are competent in the fields that they are addressing today. Our first panelist is Laurie Taylor, who is a PhD at Texas A&M University. She will speak for 25 minutes. Then we have Chandra Villanova from the Center for Public Policy Priorities, who will speak for 12 minutes. We have Rena Honey, who is president of the American Federation of Teachers, who also has 12 minutes to speak to us. And then our DISD trustee Foreman, my trustee, who will also speak for 12 minutes. After the speakers have finished, we will then have a question and answer period. I think you will see index cards on the table. If you would write your question down, and then when we're ready to actually proceed with the question and answer period, if you will hold your card up, we will have individuals who will collect those cards, and we will then go into our question and answer period. I believe those are the instructions that you need, except I always have one question that I'll ask our panelists. Did I pronounce your names correctly?
You did very well.
Great.
Awesome.
Is that Chandra? Okay, Chandra. What did I miss this time?
It's Villanueva, not Villanova.
Okay.
I think that's a college somewhere, but,
There's nothing worse than messing up people's names. So, great. And Chandra and I have been on panels before, so she knows I always provide the opportunity to make the correction. And I will practice more and more. Right. We have candidates for elected office positions. If you would stand and give us your name and tell us the office that you are competing for. Okay.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Smith. I'm running for State Board of Education District 12. We're actually in District 12 right now.
All right. Did everyone hear?
Hi, I'm Maria Ramos. I'm running for Texas House District 102, which is north of 635, Richardson, Addison, North Dallas, and Garland. And incidentally, I opened the West Campus that you all will be visiting tonight. I was hired to open that before we even built it, so it's very exciting to know that you guys are going to have an event there at that location. So anyway, thank you so much for having me today.
Well, congratulations for running for an elected office, and we wish you the best in your pursuit. Okay. I do not see any elected officials. We have one elected official. Please stand. And
I'm Karen Clardy, and I'm on the Richardson ISD School Board.
excellent.
I'm glad to be here. This is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And one former.
One former elected official, please stand.
I'm Lynette Greenhaw. I was on the Richardson ISD Board of Trustees for a number of years. I currently work for the Dallas Regional Chamber doing on education policy issues full-time. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Well, I think we have covered all of our polite issues, and so we will begin our program with our first speaker, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you to the League of Women Voters. This is an enormous honor and privilege to speak to you. I've spoken to the League once before as an absolutely green rookie straight out of grad school on behalf of the Federal Reserve Bank, and I really appreciate the fact y'all came back. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about the work that I do in school finance areas. So I was asked to talk about what drives differences in costs and differences in efficiency. The basic underlying observation here is that equal is not the same thing as equitable in education contexts. And that there are a number of factors that drive differences in what we need to spend in the classroom in order to be able to accomplish our policy goals. And I want to talk to you a bit about what drives those differences and what we do and don't know about how large some of those differences might be. So the first thing I want to tell you is that spending differs from district to district in the state of Texas. This is a graphic of the most recent year for per pupil current operating expenditures. So we're not counting any construction expenses in this diagram. We're looking at the expenditures for instruction and instructional services and administration and the general business of a school, but not the capital outlay. And what you'll observe is that there's a lot of variation in the state, but most of the districts in the state are clustered around around the state mean, which is going to be about $9,400 per pupil in instruction. And the district median, about half the districts spend more than $9,800 and change. About half the districts spend less than that. Some of our districts spend more than $20,000 per pupil on regular operating expenditures per pupil. Those tend to be extremely small districts that lack the economies of scale available to other districts. There are a couple of districts that kind of catch the eye. The two biggest in the state are Dallas and Houston, and they are able to exploit considerable economies of scale, but yet there are some substantial differences in what those two districts spend per pupil on operating expenditures. And so I want to dig into the data and talk about why there are such differences. And basically, there are a set of differences that explain why some districts spend more than others. One is that some of the districts are trying to accomplish greater things, that they're looking for better outcomes than other districts. So it's like, so they're producing higher levels of student performance, and in order to do so, they have taxed themselves and worked the formula, and they are in the position to spend more because they're doing more. Okay. Another reason why you could have is that some districts are spending resources on enrichments that other districts are not in a position to be able to provide. And so some of what you see when you see those differences in what's being spent is differences in what's being accomplished. The next big driver of why there are differences in the spending that goes on in the school districts is because there are differences in the costs of providing an adequate education in those various contexts. And the literature has kind of identified for us the usual suspects, or the big drivers or differences in how much it costs to operate school districts. One of the first is that you're serving kids with greater needs in some contexts than you are in others. Another is that you're going to be operating in a higher cost environment because of differences in labor cost or differences in economies of scale. So we know that when you think about the characteristics of the kids and what about the kids drives differences in cost, that there is near consensus in the scholarly literature that it costs more to serve a child who is economically disadvantaged than to serve a child who is not economically disadvantaged. The problem is we do such a lame job of measuring poverty and economic disadvantage in this country that we don't have a really good handle on how much more does it cost to serve an economically disadvantaged child. There's some work in the literature suggests that the additional costs associated with a disadvantaged child is less than 1%. Others suggest that it's more than 100% increase in costs. It's just this broad range in the literature. There's also a broad range in the literature as to how much more does it cost to serve an English language learner population compared to a non-learner population. The reason why there are big differences in the costs of what does it take to serve a kid living in poverty is because we mean different things in different studies by this metric. The way that the researchers typically look at student socioeconomic need is to look at eligibility for free and reduced price lunches. And there's one income threshold for family size nationwide. So the family income that makes you eligible for free lunch in New York City is the same as the family income that makes you eligible for free lunch in Texas, which is the same threshold that makes you eligible for free lunch in Brownsville or Dallas or Dalhart. Okay, and because you have this common standard of poverty facing wide differences in cost of living, you have very big differences in how desperate or how poor the children are in some states as compared to others. The poverty level in New York City barely covers the typical rent on a two-bedroom apartment. The poverty level in a rural Arkansas is something that leaves considerable money left over at the end of the month after you've paid the landlord to spend on those frivolities like food. And so you are in a situation where we don't measure need well. So surprise, surprise, we don't get the same answer from various studies about how much more does it cost to serve a child in need. If we wanted to be able to think about how much more does it cost to serve a Texas child in need, we really need to do some Texas level analysis, because what it means to be economically disadvantaged in Texas is not the same thing as what it means to be economically disadvantaged in New York, which is a source of some of these really high estimates of cost. So very English language learners, we have differences in how much does it cost to serve a child who is an English language learner. A couple of things are really striking here. One is that the literature tells us that there are some economies of scale in the classroom level in bilingual and ESL instruction. That some states like Texas have a lot of kids to be served, which means you can serve them in a classroom that is, in some sense, cost-effective size. Whereas in other settings, you're having to serve the English language learner in a kind of a pull-out format where you have a small number of students basically receiving tutoring services. And as a result, that's extremely expensive to serve those kids. So there's a critical mass that some states are able to exploit and other states are not. The literature also suggests that when all of the English language learners have a common language background, it's easier to teach and therefore cheaper to teach than if you have a variety of languages spoken in the home and you're trying to bridge Spanish to Hmong to Chinese to any number of other languages. Texas, the vast majority of English language learners speak Spanish. That puts us to a certain extent at an advantage over other states that don't have that commonality of language in the home. So another reason why there are differences in the cost of education are differences in labor cost. It costs more to hire in some parts of the state than it does in other parts of the state. The payroll dollar goes further. If you have a payroll of $10 million and the labor costs are high, you can't staff the classroom as aggressively, as effectively as you would like, as you would be able to with that same dollar amount in another community where labor costs were low, where the cost of living was low, where there were amenities that made it a desirable place to live. Okay? So you need to reflect and recognize those differences in the cost of education. This is an analysis that I did on about Texas, about what labor costs look like in Texas. This is an analysis based on variation in teacher salary, and what we're talking about here is what would the modeling predict it would cost to hire the typical Texas teacher in each of these locations. Docker spots indicate that it takes more resources to get to staff the classroom with this same person. So and there's a need to reflect these differences in labor costs. If you're interested, I brought a few hard copies of the report, and it's all available on the Mosbacher Institute website. So I encourage you to kind of check that out. What you will look at, because I know that every time I ever talk about this, everybody just zeroes in on their home neighborhood. So you can see that really dark blotch up there that would represent Dallas. And what that represents is what we all know. The cost of living in Dallas is high compared to a lot of other parts of the state. And that means the cost of hiring in Dallas is high compared to other parts of the state. And if that difference is not addressed in the funding formula, then Dallas is at a disadvantage vis-a-vis other parts of the state. with respect to trying to stretch their dollars and pinch their pennies till it hurts. Okay. Differences in cost can also arise from differences in scale. The education is a sector that has a large relationship between the size of the district and the cost of operating a school. My most recent research, which I did on behalf of the Texas Education Agency, suggests that in Texas, the cost of minimizing the size of a district is in the ballpark of about 7,700 kids. That there are substantial cost savings if you took from a tiny district to a somewhat bigger district, but those advantages peter out pretty early, and that there is no particular advantage to going from a district of 10,000 to a district of 30,000 in terms of cost advantage for those districts. What our work also suggests is that there are huge economies of scale at the school level, that it costs about 14% more to operate a school with 200 pupils than to operate a school with 400 people. You have a problem with dividing the kids across the classrooms into an effective size classroom. When the school is low, you get the joy of a very small class size, and the research does suggest that that's a positive for kids, but it's also hugely expensive and really consumes a lot of resources to operate these. The problem for Texas is we've got big swaths of Texas where you could put all the kids on a bus for 2 hours, round up every fifth grader you could find, and you still can't get to an Oakley-sized classroom. So we're going to have to operate schools that are smaller than cost minimizing in parts of the state just because of the logistics of transportation and distance. And as a result, we're going to have costs that are higher in some part of Texas than other because of these economies of scale at the school and at the district level. This is an illustration of the spending on the plotted against, current operating expenditures plotted against district size. Over here, Houston, the biggest. This is Dallas. CISD, the big spender over there is also bitsy, teeny weeny. And so what you see is that there is this kind of Nike swoosh to the relationship. Costs more to operate the very small districts than the larger ones. Okay, we did, next, sorry. The one thing we did in our consolidation study, which I thought was really important to talk about here today, is we were asked by the TEA to explore what we would expect to happen if you were to consolidate the school districts in our major metropolitan areas, in the core counties of major metropolitan areas. And what we found was that most of those districts are already scale efficient. They're big enough to have exploited all the economies of scale. And if you were to consolidate, you would lose a source of choice and competition amongst the districts, that you would wind up with essentially a single employer for teachers and a single provider for kids, and that single provider doesn't have to be very responsive. And what we have observed in repeated analyses of Texas data is that in the parts of the state where there is more choice, the districts do a better job of pinching their pennies till it hurts. They are more efficient, more lean in their operations when there is more choice in the community. Okay. So that observation that there are differences in spending that can be driven by differences in choice kind of helps undergird a project that I've been working on for a number of years here in Texas, looking at the what we call the Texas Smart Schools Initiative, which is trying to do a simple 2x2 matrix of saying, suppose we measured performance the way the scholars tell us we want to measure performance, which is as a value-added metric, and we plotted it against what they spend. Okay. How would things stack up for Texas? And what you would observe is we have some districts that are able to accomplish great things with relatively small amounts of money, and some districts that are accomplishing very little with relatively large amounts of money. And if we could just get folks to learn from the best practices of a number of the districts in Texas, we could squeeze more out of the system. That doesn't mean that necessarily every district can adopt the best practices of the one shining exemplar perfect district in the state, but rather that we need to take into consideration all these context things I told you about already, the differences in student need, the differences in scale, the differences in labor costs, and say, who's in the same boat as me, who's got similar kinds of worlds, and able to accomplish more than I do for the money that we spend. And those are the people I want the districts to find out more about. Those are the people I want them to follow. Those are the people I want them to learn from. Because we have enormous talent in this state, but we're not so great at sharing intelligence across the various districts to communicate effectively about practices that are not just effective. We do actually a better job of communicating about effective practices. We don't do much at all to communicate about cost-effective practices. And what the Smart Schools Initiative is about is trying to get to this question of better intel, better ability to identify best practices in the state by looking at the people who accomplish both dimensions, not just on performance. So this is a landing page for the website. Everything I'm going to show you is available on the web. You can kind of look up your favorite school, your favorite district. We've got multiple years worth. You want to look at a time trend, you can get there. Any data you want on the spending, we got it. We're pretty, if we don't have it, tell me about it, we'll add it. This is basically a situation where we're providing a lot of information to the parent, the taxpayer, but perhaps most importantly, the superintendent, the principal, to try and help them understand their school in some context that brings resourcing to bear. We're going to measure academic progress using a value-added measure, which is to say, essentially, how did the kids do this year compared to what you would have expected given their prior performance and their demographic characteristics. A school where kids outperform expectations are doing something right. If it's systematically explained by what school they went to and not explained by the demographics of the kids, that's what we're measuring, the value added that you can pin on the school. In the work we're doing, we're looking at the kinds of metrics that are administered grade after grade, which is focusing on the reading and mathematics skills, the basics, the reading, writing, and arithmetic part of education. When we're looking at the spending side of things, we're going to measure real expenditures, which means we're going to make adjustments for the fact that we have some districts operate as purchasing agents for other districts. You want to make sure you trace the money back where it belongs. We're going to adjust for the fact that some districts operate in high labor cost environments, so their payroll spending looks high, but it isn't really. It's because they're operating where wages are high, that they're not resourcing more intensively than other districts. So what we're trying to do is adjust for differences in labor costs. In some sense, it's like an inflation factor, like the consumer price index adjusts for differences in price over time. This adjustment adjusts for differences in price over place. And we're going to look at operating expenditures for districts. So in particular, we're going to focus on instruction-related, instructional leadership, the kinds of things that we're going to call core operating expenditures. We're going to strip out of this analysis expenditures for transportation and for food, because those are important operating components, but they're not directly related to individual student performance. Next slide. This is San Antonio ISD down in the other corner. So what you observe about San Antonio ISD is their performance is below the 20th percentile for the state, and their spending is amongst the highest in their peer group, and that is problematic in my mind. Okay. Dallas ISD is kind of middle of the packer. They're that red spot there. Okay. I should note that the comparison group for Cy-Fair and for Dallas and for San Antonio is all the set of just the big districts in Texas. They're all being compared to one another. And what you're observing is Dallas is kind of midland. Next, Richardson, up there in that upper right-hand quadrant, able to accomplish great things while spending less than other districts of similar size and similar, and I didn't even know you were going to be here. So, Plano is also ballpark, but they spend a little bit more than y'all. So, but they're also able to accomplish good things. Highland Park is spending a bit more on a per pupil basis, and they are knocking the socks off in terms of growth. This is not just levels that can be explained by the kinds of parents that they're able to attract. This is about the kids outperforming what you would expect given their prior performance, and that prior performance picks up the things that can be attributed to their family influence. This is also adjusted for demographic characteristics, the racial composition, the socioeconomic composition, the LEP composition of the school. And so what you get is too much fairer kind of take on things. Houston, middle of the pack, one more. El Paso, ISD in comparison, we got Brownsville, that's 96% economically disadvantaged and 33% ELL. They spend pretty similarly to San Antonio, which is 91% economically disadvantaged, about 19% ELL. But look at how they differ on the performance measure dimension. Here's San Antonio down here below the 20th percentile, and there's Brownsville up there above the 80th percentile. I think the people in San Antonio need to talk Brownsville. So I was asked, so what can explain this big honking gap between a place like a San Antonio and a Brownsville in the diagram? And there are a number of things. Repeated research suggests that competition fosters efficiency, that districts who have where parents have choices, districts are more responsive and they tend to have to squeeze their pennies and use them wisely. That there are some budget practices in Texas that foster inefficiency. In particular, that we have a budget practice by which districts have a striking tendency to lowball their budgets, so that they have their budgeted revenues almost always come in below their actual revenues. I'm talking 97% of the time. So they're doing the budgeting in a way that some people would think of as highly conservative. They're budgeting for a smaller dollar amount, and then the revenue comes in ahead. They never make the mistake of having budgeted to be able to spend more than they actually receive in revenue. But what that means is that they keep repeatedly getting these windfalls, which are then spent out in the system in ways that are not under the control of the budgeting process. And that has been associated in my own research with spending more, but not necessarily getting more out of it. The tighter the budget is to the actual revenue, and I understand that you can't hit it smack dab on the nose, you're never gonna, but the closer you get to budgeting for what you actually receive, the more likely you are to stick to that budget, the more likely you are to keep your spending under control. One more. And that there are some common compensation practices that foster inefficiency. In particular, we tend to pay teachers on a salary schedule that rewards increased experience and advanced degrees. The scholarship tells us that there are some strong improvements amongst teachers in the first few years, but that once they get up and running, they are really effective throughout their career. They don't continue to improve all that much. And that a master's degree doesn't necessarily make you more effective in the classroom. Okay? Then yet we continue to devote big chunks of our payroll budgets to compensating for these two characteristics that the scholarship tells us really don't connect to performance, which I'll talk about regulations that foster inefficiency if anybody wants to ask in the Q&A, but I have been given the hook. So we're running to the conclusions. Cost of education isn't the same from one place in Texas to the other. You have to recognize the difference in cost if you want to provide for an equitable system. And you have to have the structures in place to encourage those districts to use their resources wisely to get the bang for their buck if you want to have the kind of outcomes that we want to have for Texas. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Thanks everyone for coming here today. I'm Chandra Villanueva. I'm the Director of Economic Opportunity with the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and I don't have any slides for you today, and I don't even have any notes. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I feel about school finance in Texas. So when I think of our school finance system, I often think of a house that's fallen into disrepair. I think we would all agree for our home to retain its value and to run efficiently, you need to make repairs and keep up with the home and keep it painted and keep your lawn trim and all those kinds of great things. Well, unfortunately, the Texas legislature has not taken very good care of our home that we call our school finance system, and things have really fallen into disrepair. That's kind of the bad news. But the good news is that our school finance system is not a teardown. There are some really good parts of our school finance system that are worth saving and preserving as we think about how to reform and make our school finance system run more efficiently. When I was a graduate student at NYU, I actually learned that Texas has the best school finance system in the country. Imagine my surprise when I moved to Texas. And it was not quite as embraced as it was in New York City. The reasons why our school finance system is held up in a lot of other places is because we really have some strong foundations within our formulas. We were one of the very first states that recognized that different students need different levels of supports to be successful, this sort of equity angle. And we developed a system of weighted student funding. That's where we provide, that additional funding for economically disadvantaged or English language learners. That's been a really great thing. About 46 states now use a weighted funding system for their schools, and we were one of the first to adapt that. We also highly value early education and actually fund pre-K within our formulas. Not every state does that, and I believe there's still a handful of states, I don't think quite 11 anymore, but for a while there was 11 states that didn't even have a state-sponsored pre-K program, let alone one that was recognized within their funding formulas as an important part of education. And the third thing that really kind of brings Texas, up to the national level is recapture. We've recognized that property values are unequal between different parts of your neighborhood and across the state. And so we developed this system of recapture, also called Robin Hood, where we kind of take money from some of our wealthier districts and then we redistribute that funding to property poor districts and chartered schools across the state. And so even though it's not a teardown and we have these really great parts of our school finance system, even those elements can be built upon. The weighted funding system, and Lori mentioned it, we don't have a whole lot of good data on exactly how much more it takes to educate a student. But when we first developed this weighted funding student system, there was some studies done by the legislature that said that we should be spending 40% more on economically disadvantaged students. The legislature only funded it at 20%. The same study said that we should fund ELL at 20 to 40% more. The legislature set that funding at 10%. We haven't updated that since 1984. And these weights are supposed to be an additional funding on our basic allotment, which is sort of that building block that all districts start from. Well, if we say it costs 10% more of what? We don't even know what a base level of education costs. And also back, in the 80s when we were designing the school finance system, the legislature only funded about 76% of what the study said we should be putting into our base level of education. That number has been changed a lot, throughout the years, but always at the whim of the legislature. We don't adjust for inflation or any of those kinds of things to help keep up with rising costs. Right now, our base level of funding starts at $5,140, and it stayed the same for 4 years. The legislature has chosen not to change it in this last budget cycle. And all of this kind of leads up to kind of the problems that we're seeing now with recapture. I'm a big fan of recapture. It's an equity tool. It's about making sure that we level the playing field between districts. But the problem with recapture is that our legislature sets the bar for what's considered property wealthy so extremely low that all districts are just starting to trip over it. It seems like every day another district is falling into recapture. And part of the reason, for this growing recapture is that the state's not putting in its fair share. We're not setting the funding levels into realistic levels, especially when you compare them to what our property values are and how they're growing. I live in Austin, and we're sort of in that perfect storm where our property values are increasing exponentially, but we're losing students because of gentrification and affordability concerns. That makes our wealth per student grow. And that's one of the reasons why we have such very, very high recapture in Austin. I know Dallas is just about to go into recapture as well. But I can guarantee you that recapture is not the enemy. The problem with the school finance system is not the recapture taking away, it's that the state isn't recognizing what it truly costs to provide a high-quality education for every student. So not only have we let our house fall into disrepair, but in 2011 we cut $5 billion from our school funding system, and we have not fully recovered from that. I worked with a professor at UT, Dr. Michael Martyr, and we did a little look at expenditures, and we found that there was really big dips in spending on our sort of educational programs. And then when we did sort of an equity analysis and broke districts down by their percentage of low-income students, we saw that it was our low-income elementary schools that bore the most of these cuts. We saw huge reductions in bilingual education and accelerated education. Accelerated may sound like it's for the gifted and talented, but it's actually for the kids who are struggling on the STAR test and are at risk of failure and being held back a grade. And so these are the students that are struggling the most, that lost a lot of resources. And some of this isn't surprising. It's not that districts were making bad decisions and not being efficient with their funding, but of that over $5 billion cut from our schools, $1 billion was what we call outside the formula funding from sort of grant programs. A lot of those target our economically disadvantaged and English language learners. As just one example of sort of a smaller program, we had this thing called Limited English Proficient Student Success Initiative, a program that targeted English language learners who were struggling on the STAR test. That funding was completely eliminated. When those sorts of outside funding sources become completely eliminated, districts have to make the hard choices. And often they put their resources towards educating the most students, and so it's a lot of our at-risk kids that fall through the cracks. So that's kind of where we're sort of at right now, is trying to get the state to really recognize the true cost of education and to take a step back and actually try to study on their own and figure this out. And actually I'm hoping Lori Taylor might actually help with some of these things that we're trying to look into in greater depth. And I also just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of where money comes from for schools, because that's something I think that everyone is getting very upset about their property taxes. Everyone thinks that their property taxes are getting higher and higher. And it's because the state has sort of pulled a fast one on us, and they're not holding up their end of the bargain. Basically, how our school finance system works is that the state determines your bucket, how much funding that you are allowed to have for your school. And local dollars go in first. So as your community grows and prospers, you're able to fill in more of your own bucket on your own. Well, instead of the state, using all this value growth that we're seeing across the state to increase funding for schools, to increase that basic allotment, to adjust it for inflation, the state gets to benefit and puts less money into our schools each year. So all of us homeowners are paying more and more and scratching our heads saying, well, why aren't our schools getting any better? My tax bill has gone up. Well, it's because the state budget benefits from our growth, and the legislature is then able to offer tax cuts or fund other parts of the budget. And so this is really exasperated over time. There was a lawsuit in 2006 where the state Supreme Court said that that we had a de facto property tax, and so the legislature compressed tax rates by 1/3 and kept districts whole, so they increased their contribution, and we got to kind of a 50-50 split between the state and the local. But since that time, property values have continued to rise, and the state has made no effort to maintain their level of funding. So now we're in a situation where the state share has dropped down to 38%. The state is just not putting in their fair share of our funding. And again, this all gets really complicated, with recapture, because if you're a recapture district and your values are going up, your recapture payment just gets higher. And then that brings in kind of this issue of choice and charters, and which role do they play in our school finance system? And is it really efficient for us to have two separate public schools finance systems? Because what we see happening is that when a school district loses students, their wealth per student increases. One of the main reasons that Houston went into recapture is about 35,000 students have left Houston ISD for charters. And they would have been entitled to about twice the state aid that their recapture payment was if all those students were actually in Houston ISD. So everyone's concerned about recapture and this growing amount of recapture. Well, at this point, The charter network actually costs more to operate than what we're collecting in recapture. So you can make sort of that direct connection between these dollars that we collect that are supposed to be redistributed to property poor and charter schools, and it's not even enough to just cover the charter system. So in essence, all of us property taxpayers are paying for charter schools that don't have elected boards, that we don't have any, say over how they're operating. So we really have these two parallel public school systems, one with elected boards, ones that are privately managed, but it's still us property taxpayers that are paying for a school system that we have no say and no oversight over. And until the legislature wants to put in more money for the system, I think that should be a huge concern for all property taxpayers. So I will just kind of wrap up there. There's like a billion other things I could talk about with school finance. So come see me for round 2 this evening if you'd like. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Rena Honey. I am president of Alliance AFT, which is the largest teachers union in Dallas. We represent almost 6,000 employees in Dallas ISD that are not in the administration. And we work towards great classroom conditions, try to help with the salaries that are put out, the working conditions, the benefits, all of that. But before I did this, I was a classroom teacher in Dallas for 26 years. I graduated from Dallas schools, and so I truly invested in public education. I think it's the best thing since sliced bread, and I will continue to fight for that. My part is to talk about how the funding affects the classrooms. And just to start off with the very obvious, when you have more funding, you can do a lot more. You can expose the students to a lot more experiences. You can enrich their learning through those opportunities. But when you have less, obviously you can only get to the bare basics most of the times. Usually there are not enough textbooks for all of the students at one time. When I was in school, and probably many of you when you were in school, you got to take your books home to study, to do your homework. That's not the practice today because they don't have enough. And so it's mandated, well, not really mandated, but the practice is that the kids are to get their stuff done, get what they need during the class day, and then hopefully remember it or have enough that they got with them to be able to take care of their studies for the evening. So those are the two really big things, but I do have notes, and I am going to stick to them because I don't want to give misinformation anywhere. In Texas, we are at the top of the list of states with the largest cut in education, in K-12 and higher education funding since the 2008 recession. We are not doing a very good job. Like Chandra said, our funding by the state legislature right now is at 38%. When I was in school, and even before that, when my older sisters were in school, the legislature funded 75 to 78% of our public schools, which is exactly the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a free and public education. But if you talk to parents, and many of you are probably in this seat, how much money did you spend for school supplies this year? I can tell you it's more than you ever thought you needed to. I have a grandson that we're helping through school right now. I probably spent over $100 as a sophomore just for his supplies. And I'm more than happy to do that because I want him to have what he needs. But I'm telling you, the state is not meeting their obligation because our legislators don't put the importance in education, in my opinion, that they should. Yet what are their campaign formats? We have to have good, strong public schools. But when they get into office, it's like, that was just a forethought, and they don't have any intention, is the impression that people get. But we in Texas have done a very disservice of disinvesting in our public schools for our kids' education. And mind you, these are the kids that are going to take care of us as we get older. So I would think we would want to equip them with the very best, yet that doesn't seem to be the case. There was a study done, and it came from the American Federation of Teachers, but governments in 25 states have shortchanged public K-12 education by $19 billion over the last decade. That is a huge amount. So it definitely shows the impact of the devastation in our schools, in our classrooms, and the students who continue to stay in our public schools, thank goodness. And I'll tell you, I think, this is from the first chapter of the book Arena, competition is great for the business world. And there are places for competition in education. But when it comes to competition for test scores, which I can tell you right now, the curriculum that teachers teach in our public schools has to do with test-taking skills. Because now those tests determine what kind of compensation our teachers are getting. If their kids don't do well, they don't get paid very much, and they're labeled bad teachers. We got to get rid of those bad teachers. That's not always the case, because the mechanisms we have, people have to be able to understand the evaluation system. It has to be fair for everyone, and it has to be something that people can learn and grow from. In my experiences in the last 10 years, that's not where we're at. So competition in public education has taken away the collaborativeness that education needs. Our teachers don't want to share those things anymore of what they do that works, because when they share it with a younger, much less inexperienced teacher that the administration really likes, they get better scores. And we've seen it when the exact same things are printed for lesson plans, are presented in the same way, and one gets a higher score than the other. It's all dependent on the perception of the evaluator. And they're supposed to be fair and impartial, but we've seen many cases where that doesn't happen. But whatever, everybody knows that accountability is huge. And I can promise you, educators, teachers are not afraid to be evaluated, but they want it to be fair. They want it to be something that they can understand, that people can explain to them. And in Dallas ISD right now, that's not the case. Hopefully it's getting better in places, but we're still not there. So let me go on with just a few other things. Over the past decade, Texas has cut its public education by $2.5 billion, the second worst showing after Florida. And I think Chandra alluded to that just a little bit in the cuts in education. Our higher ed spending has been cut by $1.78 billion. So the higher ed educational platforms are getting less than our public schools. And I can't help but say something about the charter system. We are funding 2 educational systems in the state. Charter schools are held to some of the same standards that our public schools are, our traditional public schools, but not all. Charter schools do not have elected board members. They have a board of directors who can do whatever they want. They have private partners that put dollars in. If their charter school doesn't do well, they sell off the land and the property, move to somewhere else, and start over again. So there are 2 different systems. I had a state senator just this last week say, well, they don't have great buildings, and our public schools are not great buildings. Some of them are. Every charter school that I've seen in the last 5 years has a beautiful, brand new built building worth billions of dollars. You can go to the southern part of Dallas ISD, and you can count them. You run out of fingers and toes for all of the charters that have popped up. Dallas has lost 37,000 students to charter schools today, which should be in our public schools, but because parents and students think we're going to go to this brand new building, they've got state-of-the-art everything, it doesn't take long for some of them to realize this is not what I thought it was, and they're coming back to the public schools, which we welcome them with open arms. But when they leave our public schools, the dollars go with them. We lose them in Dallas ISD. Part of the underfunding affects our teachers and their pay. What we found in one of the reports is that the chronic underfunding explains showing that average teacher pay adjusted for inflation in Texas is lower this year in 2018 than it was in 2009. And that the per teacher pupil ratio was worse in 2016 than it was in 2008. And Texas is 43rd in per pupil spending. So it goes to show the the taxes that we have. When Chandra talked about recapture, recapture's been around for a while. It's our Robin Hood. But what we're finding is that those dollars go into the state fund and they cannot tell you where they're dispersed to. They are supposed to go to less wealthy districts. They can't tell you if that happens because they don't know where the money is going. So recapture is going to be horrible for Dallas. We're going to lose, I think it's around $49 million, $65 million in recapture payments, and our kids need that desperately. But we can do more. The funding needs to be adequate. It is not at this point. For the classroom, I can tell you teachers spend over $500 on average just to get supplies so their kids can do well. Okay, the state gives a stipend or a fund of $250. Dallas gives teachers $200. They cut $50 out of it, but that is not nearly enough. And it's not just teachers that do that. Our support staff, custodians, our teacher assistants, cafeteria people, they mentor the kids and they pay out of their pockets, and they're some of the least paid. So we definitely have challenges, but I'll tell you, our public schools in Dallas, our ISD, are doing a phenomenal job. Do we have room for improvement? Absolutely. But our kids deserve the very best, and until we get legislators in office that will pay attention to what's happening to our public schools, then we will continue to have this underfunding. We need to be active voters, and I just encourage that. I'm not going to tell you how to vote. I'm just going to say, please vote and look at the interests that are needed for our communities and our kids. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, I have to get you to stand up and stretch and all that other good stuff. My name is Joyce Foreman, and I am on the Dallas ISD School Board. This is actually my 4th year on the school board. I represent District 6, which is Southwest Oak Cliff. I know you've heard of Redbird Mall, and I'm close to Duncanville, DeSoto, Lancaster, and Cedar Hill. I'm on that end of town, and it's really kind of nice to be over here because even on this side of town, I've got 2 District 6 people here in this meeting, and then I have a church that's in District 6 that's also here in this meeting. And so we're kind of all over the place. What I wanted to do is just start out with, I'm the friendly person, so know that what I say is what I feel, and what I am is a representative of the people in District 6 overall, but at the same time I feel the importance of representing the district in its entirety. So I'll start out with good things. Most of you know the Dallas ISD has made great academic progress. We went from, in 2013-14, 43 low-performing schools to this year, or last year, 4 low-performing schools. So that's phenomenal progress, and I will accept a round of applause for that. But while we've done that, at the same time, we have opened 11 new choice schools and began to move away from some of our neighborhood schools, which is a little bit of a concern for me because the choice schools cost us more and they are lower enrolled. So there's going to be some dynamics regarding that cost. As we move into this year. We did, like I said, 11 new choice schools. But I'm the queen of fighting charter schools. Of that 37,000 young people that could be at Dallas ISD, probably about 19,000 of those kids are in my area. In my area. And I am strongly opposed. When you know that you have a charter school that starts at kinder through the 12th grade, and they're an alternative school, the parents can't know. They're not getting a better education. And of course, charter schools can't tax like your ISDs, so they're getting funding from us. Which is a problem for me. The funding is one thing, but the students mean a lot more to me, and we need to do better. I want to take just a little time talking about the district and what our budget looks like and how much we're going to be paying back to recapture. Because some people who are out here talking about the district, they act like the recapture dollars are not going to take away from our ability to actually educate our students, and they will. These are projections, so don't take them to heart, they're only projections. But in 2018-2019, we're projecting a $1.6 billion budget. 1.6 billion with a B. So this is our first year of recapture, it'll be $65 million. In 2019-2020, we're projecting 1.677 billion, but our recapture goes up to 191 million. In 2020-2021, we're projecting 1.76 billion. Our recapture goes up to 285 million. In 2021 to 2022, we're projecting 1.8 billion. Our recapture goes up to 362 million. And then in 2022 to 2023, we're projecting 1.9 billion, with our recapture going up to 442 million. That's a lot of money. But remember, at the same time, the district continues to lose students. And so the recapture could even go up more. So just with our demographic study, I'm just gonna give you just a few numbers from our demographic study. In 2017, and this I'm doing the, I'll do the moderate numbers because we got the low and we got the high and we got the moderate, so I'll go in between. Our enrollment for 2018, 156,000. 2019, 155,000. 2020, 154,000. So basically what they're telling us is we're going to be losing almost 1,000 students per year. And as we continue to lose those students, of course, we're going to have a problem managing our budget. And then I want just to take a few minutes, let me see if I can find it, to talk about the problem that we have with the state of Texas and its funding for public schools. Because what the state of Texas is actually doing is they are hitting us in two ways. As your taxes grow, the state of Texas revenue that they invest in the schools go down, and then they hit you with recapture. So that's a double whammy that nobody talks about. And I'll tell you this, in 2018-19, the state revenue, $206 million, and then recapture is $65 million. In 2019-20, the state revenue, $162 million, down from 206, and the recapture is 191. Then in 2020 to 2021, the state revenue is $179 million, recapture $285 million. So we're getting hit in more ways than one from the state of Texas. And what happens is when you have a district like Dallas ISD who have a lot of low poverty students, which it costs more to educate our kids, then we're going to continue to struggle. And raising property taxes is not the answer. The answer to me is that the citizens are going to have to revolt against the legislators and say, you need to fund our schools. We can't continue to run a dual system with charter schools not collecting any taxes and robbing from the public schools who are actually educating most of the children. That cannot continue to exist. While, Chandra? Thinks Robin Hood is not our enemy, I think it's our worst enemy in public education. Because it's not helping us by continuing to take funds away from where we need them. I will tell you, out of the 11 new choice schools in the district, guess what? None of them are in my district. None of them are in my district. But I have more charter schools in my district, or more charter children in my district than any other district. We've got to find a better way to fund public education and a better formula from the state to be able to ensure that we are actually making sure that our children are getting the education that they need. What I did not tell you is I'm a graduate of Lincoln High School. I'm a former 35-year business owner. I failed at retirement. But I love what I'm doing. This is probably one of the best things that I've ever done in my life, is to be able to make sure that children have the same opportunity that I have. I've had a great life, and I want to make sure they have the same great life, particularly children from my area, to make sure that they do some things that's going to excite us. So, and I know I'm going to get the hook in just a minute, but just to talk just a little bit more about what the ISD could change. We have a 21% administrative cost. That needs to be lowered. I am a firm believer that what we need to be doing is putting our money in the classroom. I want money going to campuses. I don't want an executive director, a director, an assistant director, a coordinator. I don't want all those. I want the money directly in the classrooms to be able to affect the children the most. The ISD did a great thing when they did the early colleges in every high school that we actually have. That was a great thing because it gives our children an opportunity to go to college and at least get an associate's degree before they finish high school. But then the Promise program came along, which also helps our children. because with the Promise program, they're even able to get a 4-year education. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be focused on, making sure that these kids get what they need. And then I'll leave with one thing, which might make some people happy and might not make some others happy. Pre-K in the district, all children are not able to access it. All children are not able to access it. If we're going to pay for pre-K, if the district is going to pay for pre-K, and if you come to any board meetings, you'll hear me talk about it, it needs to be universal. You cannot keep telling me that a group of kids are further behind in every subject at every grade level, but they don't have an opportunity to start at the same place that other kids start. You cannot tell me that. And I will continue to fight for the kids in this district, no matter what it takes. Remember, I failed at retirement.